For nearly 2 centuries, a vast and ancient land was governed from offices thousands of miles away. Decisions made in London shaped villages in Bengal, cities in Delhi, and fields across the Indian subcontinent. Britain did not rule India by force alone. It ruled through laws, administrators, systems, and carefully controlled power. This is the story of how Britain governed India. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here and for taking time to explore history together. Today's story explains how Britain governed India. Not just as an empire, but as an administrative machine. British rule in India was built on paperwork, revenue, and a small group of officials controlling millions of lives. Understanding how India was governed helps explain why the empire lasted so long, and why its effects are still felt today. Before we begin, consider this question. Was British governance in India a system of order and administration, or a method designed to control and extract wealth? Share your thoughts. And let us begin. In the year 1600, a small group of merchants received royal permission to form a trading company with ambitious hopes. This organization, later known as the East India Company, marked the beginning of British involvement in India. At this moment, there was no vision of empire. There were no plans for governance, administration, or territorial control. The goal was simple and commercial. Buy valuable goods, sell them at profit, and return wealth to Britain. The world the company entered was already complex and powerful. India was not a land waiting to be ruled. It was home to ancient empires, wealthy cities, and established systems of governance. Trade routes linked ports to inland markets, and merchants from across Asia, Africa, and Europe competed for access. British traders were newcomers, cautious and dependent. Their success depended entirely on permission from Indian rulers. Without approval, they could not anchor, trade, or build. This reality shaped every decision the company made during its first decades. Trading posts were gradually established in key coastal locations. Surat became the first major base on the western coast, a port already alive with international commerce. British agents rented warehouses, negotiated contracts, and worked under strict regulations imposed by local authorities. Their presence was tolerated, not dominant. Further along the coast, Madras emerged as another foothold. A modest settlement grew around a fortified trading post, offering protection against piracy and local unrest. Even here, the company remained vulnerable. Supplies, labor, and security all depended on cooperation with surrounding powers. Bombay entered British hands through royal diplomacy rather than conquest. Transferred as part of a marriage agreement, it offered a natural harbor with strategic promise. Still, its early years were difficult. Disease, limited resources, and political uncertainty kept British ambitions in check. In the east, Calcutta developed along the river systems of Bengal. The region's rich textile production made it highly attractive for trade. British merchants built warehouses and docks, carefully navigating the politics of one of India's most prosperous provinces. Once again, authority rested elsewhere. Throughout the 17th century, company officials thought like businessmen. Their daily concerns were prices, shipments, losses, and profits. Clerks filled ledgers with numbers. Ships arrived and departed with the changing seasons. Fortifications were built not for conquest, but for protection. The company had no power to govern land or people. It collected no taxes, passed no laws, and commanded no loyalty beyond its employees. When disputes arose, company agents appealed to local courts and rulers. They paid customs duties and accepted restrictions. In every sense, they operated at the mercy of Indian authority. Yet trade had consequences beyond commerce. Permanent settlements meant permanent presence. Over time, company officials learned local languages, customs, and political dynamics. Relationships formed with merchants, bankers, and intermediaries. Knowledge accumulated quietly, year after year. The balance of power began to shift slowly, almost unnoticed. Competition between European trading companies intensified. The need to protect trade routes increased. Guards were hired. Small military units were organized to defend warehouses and ships. These forces were limited, but they marked a subtle change. At the same time, political conditions within India were evolving. Regional conflicts created instability in some areas. Local rulers sought allies, revenue, and military support. The company found itself drawn into these rivalries, not as a ruler, but as a useful partner. With money came influence. With influence came responsibility for security. British officials increasingly acted as negotiators, advisors, and power brokers. Still, governance was not yet the goal. Any authority exercised was indirect and carefully justified as protection of trade. By the early 18th century, company settlements had grown larger and more fortified. European-style administration appeared inside these enclaves. Rules governed employees, courts resolved internal disputes, and order was enforced within company walls. Outside them, Indian rulers still held power. This period between 1600 and 1757 was defined by transition rather than domination. The company remained officially a trading enterprise, but its activities extended beyond buying and selling. Each treaty signed, each guard posted, and each dispute mediated nudged it closer to political involvement. The idea of ruling India did not arrive suddenly. It emerged from decades of adaptation to local realities. British officials responded to opportunity and threat, often improvising rather than planning. Governance was not claimed. It crept in through necessity. By the middle of the 18th century, the East India Company stood at the edge of transformation. Its commercial roots were still visible, but its role was changing. Trade had opened doors to power, and power was beginning to reshape purpose. From traders to administrators, the journey was gradual and uncertain. Britain governed nothing at first, and everything that followed grew from this modest beginning. Between 1600 and 1757, the foundations were laid for a dramatic shift, one that would redefine the company, India, and the future of empire. In the humid plains of Bengal, the year 1757 marked a quiet beginning to a profound transformation. What appeared at first as a regional conflict soon reshaped the destiny of an entire subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey was brief in duration, but its consequences echoed far beyond the riverbanks where it was fought. Before this moment, Bengal stood as one of the richest regions in India. Its fertile lands, thriving trade, and skilled artisans made it a prize for any power-seeking influence. The British East India Company had long traded there, operating through agreements and permissions granted by local rulers. Its presence was commercial, its ambitions officially limited to profit. The political landscape of Bengal was already fragile. Court rivalries, shifting alliances, and internal divisions weakened centralized authority. Court rivalries, shifting alliances, and internal divisions weakened centralized authority. The Nawab's court was filled with competing interests, each seeking advantage. The Nawab's court was filled with competing interests, each seeking advantage. Into this environment stepped the company, careful in words but deliberate in action. The Battle of Plassey did not resemble the great clashes of empires seen elsewhere. It was shaped by negotiation, hesitation, and divided loyalties. When the fighting ended, the company emerged victorious. This military success gave it something far more valuable than territory alone. It delivered political influence. With victory came leverage. The company began to shape the leadership of Bengal, supporting figures favorable to its interests. Decisions once made in local courts were now influenced by foreign merchants backed by armed force. Power shifted subtly, almost invisibly, but it shifted decisively. The years that followed Plassey revealed the true impact of this change. The company no longer acted merely as a guest in Bengal. It became an active participant in governance, directing policy through pressure and persuasion. Trade privileges expanded. Financial demands increased. Local authority grew dependent on company support. Revenue systems that had supported public works and courtly life were redirected. Wealth flowed increasingly toward company coffers. The region remained prosperous in appearance, but control over its resources was slipping away from traditional hands. Military strength underpinned this transformation. The company expanded its forces, recruiting Indian soldiers. Recruiting Indian soldiers and training them to European methods. Fortifications were strengthened. Strategic points were secured. Armed presence ensured that political agreements were upheld, not by mutual trust, but by the threat of force. Yet the most decisive moment came not on a battlefield, but at a negotiating table. In 1765, the company received the right to collect land revenue in Bengal. This grant, known as the Diwani, marked a turning point unlike any before it. For the first time, a private trading company gained direct control over taxation in a vast and wealthy region. Revenue collection was the heart of governance. It funded armies, administration, and authority itself. By controlling land revenue, the company assumed responsibilities that defined a ruling power. It now decided how much was collected, from whom, and for what purpose. This change transformed the nature of the company entirely. Trade remained important, but governance took center stage. Company officials became administrators, judges, and revenue officers. Decisions once rooted in local custom were replaced by new systems designed to maximize income and efficiency. For the people of Bengal, the shift was deeply felt. Farmers and landholders faced new assessments and unfamiliar rules. Intermediaries multiplied. Accountability became distant. The Campania's priorities focused on stable revenue flows rather than local welfare. Political authority followed economic control. Resources funded further military campaigns and administrative growth. Success in one region enabled ambition in others. The Campania's power began to stretch across eastern India. This transformation was gradual, but its direction was clear. The company no longer needed to negotiate as an equal with Indian rulers. It could dictate terms. Its officials answered not to local populations, but to directors overseas who measured success in profit and stability. The years between 1757 and 1765 reshaped the balance of power. What made this moment so significant was not just the loss of sovereignty, but the method by which it occurred. There was no formal declaration of conquest. No crown claimed Bengal outright. Instead, authority shifted through agreements enforced by military strength and economic pressure. The company had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply trading under the protection of local rulers. It had become a governing authority in its own right. This new role carried consequences it was not fully prepared to manage, but it embraced the opportunity nonetheless. Administrative challenges mounted. Corruption, mismanagement, and competing interests emerged within company ranks. The demands of governance proved more complex than commerce. Yet the flow of revenue continued, reinforcing the system despite its flaws. By 1765, the transformation was undeniable. Bengal was no longer ruled solely by its traditional institutions. The East India Company stood at the center of power, controlling revenue, influencing politics, and commanding military force. This turning point altered the course of Indian history. It demonstrated how military victory could translate into political dominance, and how economic control could replace diplomacy as the foundation of rule. From this moment onward, the Campania's path was set. What began as trade had evolved into empire. The fields and rivers of Bengal had become the starting point for a new era, one defined by foreign governance and expanding control. The years between Plassey and the Diwani were short, but their impact was vast. In less than a decade, a trading body became a ruler. The turning point of Bengal marked the beginning of a transformation that would shape the subcontinent for generations to come. In the decades after the mid-18th century, the East India Company transformed from a trading enterprise into a governing power. Its authority did not rest only on soldiers and forts. It was built on revenue control of land, and the taxes drawn from it became the foundation of company rule in India. What began as commercial interest slowly hardened into an administrative system designed to extract wealth on a vast scale. In 1765, the company gained the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This moment marked a profound shift. The company was no longer simply negotiating with local rulers. It now stood between the land and the people who worked it. Revenue collection became the primary tool through which authority was exercised, measured, and enforced. Land was carefully surveyed and classified. Officials sought to translate complex local practices into fixed numbers on paper. Crops, seasons, and customary rights were reduced to assessments and deadlines. Tax demands were set in advance, often without regard for weather, harvest quality, or local conditions. The rhythm of rural life was forced to adjust to the schedule of the company treasury. In 1793, one of the most significant revenue systems was introduced. The permanent settlement fixed land revenue demands in perpetuity and recognized landlords as the primary collectors. On paper, it promised stability and order. In practice, it reshaped society. Landlords were expected to deliver revenue on time, regardless of circumstances. And failure meant loss of rights. For peasants, the consequences were severe. They did not negotiate directly with the company but with intermediaries driven by pressure from above. Heavy taxes became a constant burden. A poor harvest or illness could quickly lead to debt. Land that had been cultivated for generations could be lost through auction and transfer. The company viewed revenue as essential fuel. Taxes funded armies, paid officials, and built infrastructure that served administration and control. Every regiment raised and every office staff depended on money drawn from the countryside. Governance and extraction became inseparable. To rule was to collect, and to collect was to rule. Other regions experienced different systems, but the logic remained similar. In some areas, revenue was collected directly from cultivators. In others, intermediaries played a central role. Each system aimed to maximize predictability and income for the company. Flexibility, once a feature of local arrangements, was replaced by rigid expectations. Each system aimed to maximize predictability and income for the company. Flexibility, once a feature of local arrangements, was replaced by rigid expectations. The pressure to meet revenue targets shaped behavior at every level. Local officials were judged by the amounts they delivered. Failure could end a career. This created incentives to enforce demands strictly, sometimes harshly. Compassion and discretion were discouraged by fear of shortfall. The human cost was often invisible to those recording figures in distant offices. Over time, rural economies were reshaped. Farmers shifted crops to meet tax needs rather than local consumption. Cash crops gained importance, tying villages to global markets they could not control. Fluctuations in prices and demand added new layers of risk. Security became fragile, dependent on forces far beyond the field. Resistance did not disappear, but it changed form. Open defiance was rare and dangerous. More often, it appeared as flight, evasion, or quiet noncompliance. Some abandoned land altogether. Others borrowed at high interest to survive, sinking deeper into dependency. The system pressed forward regardless. By the early 19th century, revenue administration had become highly organized. Detailed records filled offices. Maps, tables, and reports flowed upward through the hierarchy. On paper, the system appeared efficient and rational. On the ground, it often felt relentless and unforgiving. The wealth extracted through these systems played a crucial role in expanding company power. Armies grew larger and more disciplined. Territories expanded through war and treaty. Each new conquest brought new lands to be assessed and taxed. The cycle repeated, feeding itself through expansion and extraction. Yet the system carried hidden instability. Heavy demands left little margin for crisis. Famines, when they occurred, exposed the limits of rigid revenue policies. The company struggled to balance humanitarian concern with fiscal need. Too often, revenue expectations remained unchanged even as suffering spread. By the 1850s, resentment had accumulated across many layers of society. Landlords faced pressure from above. Peasants bore the heaviest weight below. Officials enforced rules they did not design. Revenue, the backbone of company rule, also became one of its greatest vulnerabilities. When rebellion erupted in 1857, it was fueled by many causes, but economic strain formed part of the background. Decades of extraction had altered relationships between ruler and ruled. Trust had eroded. Authority was seen less as protection and more as demand. Company rule and its revenue systems had bound governance tightly to economic extraction. They created a powerful administrative machine capable of sustaining empire. They also reshaped society in ways that generated lasting tension. By tying rule to revenue so completely, the company ensured that economic hardship would always carry political consequence. From 1765 to 1857, land tax stood at the center of British power in India. British authority in India was not built on armies alone. Alongside soldiers and forts came something quieter, but equally powerful. Law became an instrument of rule, shaping daily life and defining who held power. Through courts and codes, empire asserted control without always raising a weapon. As British influence expanded, legal systems followed close behind. Courts were established in major towns and administrative centers. They were presented as symbols of order, reason, and stability. For many, they represented a new kind of authority, written rather than enforced by force. English legal principles formed the foundation of this system. Ideas of contract, property, and procedure were introduced and standardized. Written records replaced oral custom. Decisions were documented, archived, and referenced. Law became something that could be studied, appealed, and enforced consistently. At the center of this structure stood company officials. Men trained in administration rather than local tradition acted as judges and magistrates. They combined executive and judicial power in ways unfamiliar to Indian society. A single official might collect taxes, oversee policing, and decide legal disputes. This blending of roles gave British authorities enormous influence. Law was no longer separate from governance. It became one of its primary tools. Through court rulings and regulations, the company extended its reach into villages and markets. Traditional Indian rulers were gradually pushed aside. Their courts, once central to local governance, lost authority. Disputes that might have been resolved through custom or community leaders were redirected to British courts. Over time, local legal traditions were marginalized or absorbed into the colonial framework. The language of the law also mattered. English became the language of higher courts and official proceedings. This created a barrier for many Indians, who depended on intermediaries to navigate the system. Access to justice required knowledge, translation, and resources not equally available to all. Law brought a sense of predictability valued by merchants and administrators. Contracts could be enforced. Property rights were clarified. Trade benefited from consistent rules. For the empire, this stability encouraged investment and control. Yet the same system revealed deep inequality. British officials enjoyed legal privileges not extended to ordinary Indians. Jurisdiction often depended on race rather than circumstance. Punishments differed, and accountability was uneven. The law claimed neutrality, but its application reflected power. Courtrooms became stages where authority was displayed. Over time, the legal system expanded in complexity. Codes were drafted, procedures formalized, and hierarchies established. High courts oversaw lower ones, creating a pyramid of authority. Appeals could travel upward, but resolution was slow and costly. For many Indians, the courts were places of both hope and frustration. Some found protection through written law. Others encountered delay, expense, and unfamiliar rules. Justice was possible, but never guaranteed equally. Law also served as a means of surveillance and control. Regulations governed movement, land use, and economic activity. Violations were recorded and punished through legal channels. The presence of law reduced the need for constant military enforcement. British authority gained legitimacy by appearing lawful. Rulings were justified through statutes and precedent. Power was exercised through documents rather than decrees. This created an image of rule based on reason rather than domination. Yet beneath this image lay imbalance. Legal reforms were designed to support imperial interests. Revenue collection, land ownership, and trade regulations favored the ruling power. When conflict arose between imperial needs and local welfare, law often sided with authority. Lawyers, clerks, and interpreters emerged as a new professional class. They learned British law and used it skillfully. Some challenged authority within the very framework created to control them. Arguments for rights, representation, and reform were framed in legal language. Courts became arenas where colonial authority was questioned, even if cautiously. Law, intended to stabilize empire, also exposed its contradictions. The promise of justice remained uneven. While order was established, equality was not. The system functioned efficiently for those it was designed to serve. For others, it reinforced distance between ruler and ruled. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, law had become central to British governance. It shaped administration, economy, and social relations. Courts stood as symbols of imperial presence, visible in architecture and ritual. Authority was no longer only worn in uniform. It was written in legal codes. The legacy of this system endured beyond empire. Institutions built under British rule did not vanish overnight. Courts, procedures, and legal education remained after independence. They carried both strengths and limitations inherited from their origins. Law had helped Britain govern vast territories with limited force. It created order that served empire effectively. But it also revealed the limits of justice under unequal power. In the end, British authority rested on both law and force, intertwined. The courts of empire promised fairness, structure, and stability. Yet their foundations were shaped by control. Through law, Britain ruled minds as well as territory. Order was achieved, but equality remained unfinished. In 1857, a deep and unexpected rupture spread across northern India. What began as scattered resistance quickly grew into a wide uprising that challenged the authority of the East India Company. The land, long governed through contracts, revenue systems, and military discipline, entered a moment of uncertainty that neither side fully controlled. The company had ruled through a delicate balance of power. Its army relied heavily on Indian soldiers, trained, organized, and commanded under foreign authority. For years this structure appeared stable. Yet beneath the surface, tension had been building. Changes in military practice, social policy, and administration unsettled long-standing customs. Trust weakened quietly, until it broke. Indian soldiers were among the first to challenge company rule. Their grievances were shaped by discipline, pay, promotion, and cultural interference. Military service demanded loyalty, but offered limited respect. When confidence in leadership faltered, the consequences were immediate. Units that had once enforced order now questioned it. Civilians soon became involved. Towns and villages were drawn into the unrest, driven by local concerns and broader frustration with company policies. Land revenue systems, legal changes, and the erosion of traditional authority had altered daily life. The rebellion was not uniform in cause or character, but its spread revealed how fragile company control had become. The uprising shook British confidence deeply. For decades, the company had presented itself as secure and efficient. Now, that image cracked. Communication lines failed. Garrisons were isolated. Decisions were made under pressure and uncertainty. The belief that a small ruling force could permanently manage a vast and complex society was suddenly in doubt. As the revolt intensified, the response grew harsher. Reinforcements arrived. Control was reasserted through force and coordination. By 1858, the rebellion was crushed. Resistance was overcome region by region, leaving behind silence where urgency once surged. The immediate challenge ended, but its impact did not. The cost of the revolt was high. Lives were lost. Communities were disrupted. Confidence on both sides was permanently altered. For the company, the rebellion exposed the limits of rule driven by profit and delegation. It had governed like a corporation, but faced the realities of sovereignty. Responsibility could not be divided or distanced. Governance required accountability at the highest level. The solution was decisive and symbolic. In Britain, the events of 1857 prompted urgent reassessment. The idea that a trading company could rule a subcontinent was no longer acceptable. Responsibility could not be divided or distanced. Governance required accountability at the highest level. The solution was decisive and symbolic. The East India Company was dissolved. Its long chapter in Indian history came to an end. Authority passed directly to the British Crown. This change was more than administrative. It marked a new phase of governance, one that sought to restore confidence through centralized control and clearer responsibility. Under Crown rule, the structure of administration shifted. Policies were reviewed. Military organization was reorganized. Greater emphasis was placed on preventing unified resistance. Recruitment strategies changed. Communication improved. The goal was stability through oversight rather than delegation. Indian society felt these changes in varied ways. Some reforms promised protection of tradition. Others tightened control. The new system aimed to avoid the miscalculations that had led to rebellion, but it did not abandon imperial priorities. Power remained distant, though now more formally defined. The army was reshaped with caution. Indian soldiers continued to serve, but under revised conditions. Loyalty was emphasized. Cultural sensitivities were managed more carefully. Yet the fundamental hierarchy remained. The lessons of 1857 influenced every decision related to military and civil authority. For many Indians, the revolt became a powerful memory. It represented resistance, sacrifice, and the possibility of challenge. Even in defeat, it altered perception. The idea that company rule was unshakable was gone. A new awareness settled into public consciousness. For British governance, the revolt became a warning. Administration could not rely solely on efficiency and force. Understanding, adaptation, and control had to coexist. The Crown aimed to project authority while avoiding the errors of the past. Whether it succeeded fully remained an open question. The transition from company to Crown rule did not bring immediate peace or equality. It brought structure, clarity, and a firmer chain of command. The empire adjusted, learning from shock rather than abandoning control. The rebellion had not ended imperial rule, but it had reshaped it. It marked the end of one system and the beginning of another. It revealed the limits of corporate governance and the consequences of ignoring social and cultural realities. It forced change through crisis. In the years that followed, India moved into a new administrative era. The authority behind them hardened. The memory of rebellion lingered, shaping policy and perception alike. This was not simply a revolt, nor merely a transfer of power. It was a moment when confidence collapsed and governance transformed. The uprising shook the foundations of rule, and from its aftermath emerged a new phase of empire, more cautious, more centralized, and deeply shaped by the lessons of 1857. After 1858, the nature of British rule in India changed forever. The rebellion had ended company rule, and authority passed directly to the British Crown. What emerged was a new system known as the British Raj, a structure designed to centralize power, prevent future uprisings, and govern a vast population with careful control. At the top of this system stood the Viceroy, appointed to represent the Crown. From grand residences in Calcutta and later Delhi, the Viceroy acted as the supreme authority in India. Decisions taken in these offices shaped the lives of millions, even though the ruler himself was far removed from the daily realities of Indian life. Below the Viceroy stretched a layered hierarchy of administration. Provinces were divided, districts mapped, and responsibilities clearly defined. Governors and lieutenant governors oversaw large regions, while district officers handled taxation, law, and order at the local level. This structure was designed to ensure that authority flowed downward in a controlled and predictable way. The backbone of this system was the Indian civil service. This elite group of administrators wielded enormous influence. Numbering only a few thousand at most, they governed a subcontinent of extraordinary size and diversity. Through reports, inspections, and strict procedures, they maintained a firm grip on administration. Entry into the civil service was highly competitive and largely inaccessible to Indians during this period. Examinations were held far away, in Britain, favoring those educated within British institutions. As a result, power rested in the hands of a small and distant elite who believed efficiency and order justified their rule. District officers became the face of the Raj. They collected revenue, supervised police, resolved disputes, and enforced regulations. Riding on horseback or traveling by rail, they moved between towns and villages, representing authority backed by law and force. Their decisions carried weight far beyond their numbers. Central control depended not only on people, but on systems. Laws were standardized, records meticulously kept, and communication streamlined. The Raj aimed to replace what it viewed as disorder with uniform rules. In practice, this often meant ignoring local customs in favor of centralized regulations. Infrastructure played a crucial role in strengthening control. Railways spread rapidly across the subcontinent, linking distant regions to administrative centers. Trains allowed troops to move quickly, officials to travel efficiently, and goods to be transported with precision. What appeared as progress also served the machinery of rule. Telegraph lines stretched alongside rail tracks, shrinking distances that once took weeks to cross. Messages that had once relied on messengers could now be sent in moments. This technology allowed the government to respond swiftly to unrest, coordinate policies, and maintain constant oversight. Roads expanded into rural areas, connecting villages to district headquarters. While these routes facilitated trade and movement, they also enabled surveillance and intervention. Authority could reach places that had once been remote, tightening the web of administration. The Raj presented these developments as signs of modernization. Yet freedom was not their purpose. Infrastructure served the needs of governance, revenue collection, and security. Benefits to ordinary people were secondary to maintaining order and stability. Indian participation in governance remained limited. While some Indians were employed in lower administrative roles, real power stayed with British officials. Decisions were made from above, with consultation carefully controlled. The memory of 1857 shaped every policy. Fear of rebellion lingered, influencing military organization and administrative caution. The army was restructured to prevent unity among Indian soldiers. And civil authority worked closely with military power to ensure compliance. Between 1858 and 1900, the Raj focused on consolidation rather than expansion. Borders were secured, princely states monitored, and dissent carefully watched. The system aimed to appear stable and unchanging, projecting confidence. Even as underlying tensions grew. For many Indians, the Raj felt distant and impersonal. Laws arrived without explanation. Taxes were collected without consent. And decisions were enforced without representation. The language of administration was foreign. And access to power remained limited. Yet the machinery of rule functioned with remarkable efficiency. A small cadre of officials managed vast territories through paperwork, discipline, and infrastructure. This was the strength and the weakness of the Raj. It controlled, but it did not belong. By the end of the 19th century, British authority in India seemed secure. Railways crisscrossed the land, telegraphs hummed with messages, and civil servants continued their routines. But beneath this order lay questions that would not disappear. Central control had been achieved, but at a cost. The Raj governed millions with few voices heard. Stability was maintained, yet dissatisfaction quietly spread. The system that emerged after 1858 was powerful, disciplined, and distant. The British Raj between 1858 and 1900 was not built on popular support, but on administration and control. It ruled through structure rather than consent, through systems rather than connection. Its legacy would shape India long after the empire itself began to fade. British rule in India was not maintained by force alone. It rested on careful observation, calculated decisions, and constant political management. From the early years of empire, British administrators understood that governing a vast and diverse land required more than armies and laws. It required controlling how people related to one another. India was home to many religions, languages, castes, and regional identities. These differences had existed for centuries, shaping social life and local politics. Under British rule, they became objects of study and strategy. Officials recorded customs, classified communities, and mapped social boundaries with great attention. Knowledge became a tool of governance. Rather than encouraging a shared political identity, the administration focused on managing difference. Religion was carefully noted in censuses and official records. Caste categories were fixed into rigid forms. Regions were treated as distinct units with separate interests. These divisions were not created by the British, but they were emphasized and institutionalized. The logic behind this approach was simple. A divided society was easier to govern than a united one. If communities focused on their own concerns, they were less likely to organize together. Political unity, which could challenge imperial authority, was quietly discouraged. Policies reflected this thinking. Representation, when it existed, was often based on separate identities rather than common goals. Councils and advisory bodies were introduced with great caution. They gave the appearance of inclusion, but their power was limited by design. Membership was restricted. Debates were permitted, but outcomes were controlled. The system created a sense of involvement without surrendering authority. Governance was framed as protective and orderly. Officials spoke of maintaining peace and balance among communities. They presented themselves as neutral arbiters, standing above local rivalries. Yet this neutrality was shaped by imperial interests. Stability mattered more than representation. Order mattered more than political growth. The fear of rebellion influenced every decision. Memories of past uprisings lingered in administrative thinking. Preventing unrest became a central goal. Surveillance expanded. Intelligence networks monitored meetings, publications, and influential figures. Signs of cooperation across communities were watched closely. Education policies followed similar patterns. Schools produced clerks and administrators who could serve the system. But broader political education was limited. History and civics were taught in ways that emphasized gradual progress and loyalty. Critical discussion of power was discouraged. Economic policies also reflected political management. Different regions were tied to different economic roles. Others became administrative centers. This uneven development reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance. Communities experienced empire differently, shaping distinct priorities and grievances. The legal system reinforced separation. Personal laws were applied differently based on religion. Customary practices were preserved selectively. While presented as respect for tradition, this approach fixed identities into legal categories. Flexibility gave way to classification. British officials often believed they were preserving harmony. In reality, they were freezing social boundaries that had once been more fluid. By defining communities rigidly, the administration shaped how people saw themselves and others. Identity became political. At the same time, real political power remained firmly British. Key positions in administration, finance, and security were held by imperial officers. Decisions affecting millions were made by a small group, often far removed from local realities. Consultation did not equal control. This system created distance between rulers and the ruled. Policies were efficient on paper, but disconnected from lived experience. Because channels for genuine participation were closed, frustration found expression elsewhere. In social movements, cultural revival, and eventually political activism. British governance aimed to manage society, not mobilize it. Participation was seen as a risk. Unity was seen as a threat. Stability was measured by the absence of open resistance, not by consent. Yet change was unavoidable. Railways, print media, and education connected people in new ways. Ideas traveled faster. Comparisons were made. The very tools used to administer the empire also spread awareness. As Indians interacted across regions and communities, shared concerns emerged. Economic pressure, legal inequality, and political exclusion were widely felt. The British response remained cautious. Reforms were introduced slowly, always limited, always reversible. Each concession was balanced by safeguards to protect imperial authority. Trust in local political capacity was low. By managing divisions, the empire delayed unified opposition, but it could not prevent the growth of political consciousness forever. The system succeeded in maintaining control for decades, but it did so by narrowing political space. Divide and rule was not a single policy, but a mindset. It shaped administration, law, education, and representation. It sought to manage difference rather than transform it. It aimed to prevent rebellion rather than encourage participation. This approach defined much of British political management in India. It created order without inclusion, stability without equality, and governance without shared power. The empire appeared strong, but its strength rested on careful control rather than collective agreement. In time, the limits of this system would become clear. A society managed through division could be governed, but not forever contained. The legacy of political management shaped the path ahead, leaving behind structures that would influence the struggle for unity and self-rule in the years to come. In 1914, the outbreak of a global war placed unprecedented strain on the British Empire. For India, the conflict arrived not as a distant European struggle but as an immediate demand. Decisions made in imperial capitals reached deep into the subcontinent, reshaping governance, economy, and daily life. World War I became a test not only of military strength, but of control itself. India was drawn fully into the war effort. Soldiers were recruited in large numbers, transported across oceans to unfamiliar fronts. They fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, serving far from home under harsh conditions. Their presence became essential to imperial strategy, filling gaps as British forces were stretched thin across multiple theaters. Beyond manpower, India supplied vast financial resources. Taxes increased. Loans were raised. And local revenues were redirected to support the war. The colonial administration focused relentlessly on meeting imperial needs. Budgets were reorganized, priorities shifted, and long-term development was postponed in favor of immediate military demands. Factories and workshops expanded production for the war effort. Textiles, metals, and other materials flowed toward military supply chains. Railways worked at capacity, moving troops and goods with urgency. Ports grew crowded with ships carrying men and materials abroad. The economy was mobilized, but the burden was unevenly shared. For many Indians, daily life grew harder. Prices rose as shortages spread. Essential goods became more difficult to obtain. Rural areas faced pressure as food supplies were redirected and transport networks prioritized military needs. The war economy touched every household, often without explanation or consent. Emergency powers expanded government authority over trade, movement, and communication. Decisions were centralized, and dissent was closely watched. Efficiency became the guiding principle, sometimes at the expense of dialogue or trust. The language of necessity justified measures that would have been unacceptable in peacetime. At the same time, British officials understood that cooperation could not be taken for granted. Indian soldiers and civilians were making sacrifices on a massive scale. To sustain support, promises of reform began to circulate. Statements hinted at future political progress, greater participation, and recognition of Indian contributions once the war was over. These promises carried weight. Many believed that loyalty during wartime would be rewarded afterward. Political leaders and organizations urged patience, arguing that cooperation might lead to meaningful change. Hope spread alongside hardship, creating a fragile balance between expectation and endurance. As the war dragged on, cracks began to appear. The scale of sacrifice grew clearer, while tangible progress remained distant. Administrative reforms were discussed but delayed. Decisions were postponed, committees formed, and reports written. For many, words replaced action. The end of the war in 1918 brought relief, but also disappointment. Soldiers returned home with stories of distant lands and hard fighting. They expected recognition and change. Instead, they found an administration struggling to return to normal. Inflation persisted, and employment was uncertain. British governance faced a new challenge. The war had revealed how deeply the empire depended on India. It had also raised expectations that could not easily be contained. Efforts to reassert authority were cautious but firm. Emergency measures lingered longer than many had anticipated. Discontent grew across Indian society. Political organizations expanded their reach, drawing support from those who felt overlooked and exhausted by years of sacrifice. Students, workers, and professionals began to question the legitimacy of decisions made without their voice. The contrast between wartime promises and post-war reality sharpened resentment. The war also changed perceptions of power. Indian soldiers had fought alongside Europeans, witnessing both strength and vulnerability. The myth of imperial invincibility had been weakened. If Britain could be stretched so thin by war, then its hold on India might not be permanent. Economic strain continued to influence political attitudes. Rural communities struggled with debt and recovery. Urban centers faced unemployment and unrest. The administrative focus on control rather than reform deepened the sense of distance between rulers and ruled. British officials debated their next steps. Some argued for gradual reform to stabilize the situation. Others believed firmness was necessary to prevent disorder. This lack of clarity led to uneven policy, alternating between concession and restriction. Trust, already fragile, eroded further. World War I had tested British governance in ways few had anticipated. It had forced the administration to mobilize India's resources fully, exposing the limits of imperial control. The machinery of rule functioned, but at significant cost to legitimacy and confidence. By the end of the war years, India was no longer politically quiet. The experience of sacrifice without swift reward left a deep impression. The relationship between empire and colony had been altered. Not through sudden revolution, but through prolonged strain. The period from 1914 to 1918 revealed a critical truth. Control maintained through extraction and emergency powers could sustain a war. But it could not restore trust. Promises delayed became sources of anger. Administration focused solely on war needs had neglected the growing demand for representation and respect. As peace returned to the world, India stood changed. The war had bound economy, governance, and control together in ways that could not easily be undone. Discontent, once limited, had spread across society. The conflict had ended, but its political consequences were only beginning to unfold. After 1919, the foundations of British governance in India began to shift in visible and unsettling ways. The end of the Great War did not bring calm to the subcontinent. Instead, it unleashed expectations that could no longer be contained. Promises made during wartime now demanded fulfillment. Indian society was changing rapidly. Education had expanded, communication had improved, and political awareness had deepened. A growing number of Indians questioned why decisions about their future were still made elsewhere. The demand for self-rule moved from private discussion into public action. Leaders emerged who spoke with clarity and resolve. They called for dignity, representation, and authority over Indian affairs. Their message resonated far beyond urban centers. Villages, towns, and industrial areas became part of a shared political awakening. Protests spread across the country. Public gatherings, boycotts, and marches became common sights. Participation cut across regions and social groups. What had once been limited agitation transformed into a mass movement. British officials watched with concern. The administrative system had been designed to manage obedience, not organize dissent. Maintaining order now required constant attention. The balance between authority and consent grew increasingly fragile. The response from Britain followed two paths at once. On one hand, reforms were introduced to ease pressure. On the other, repression was used to contain unrest. This dual strategy reflected uncertainty at the heart of imperial governance. New laws expanded political participation in limited ways. Indian representation increased in councils and assemblies. Elections were introduced, and local governments gained modest authority. These changes were presented as steps toward partnership. Yet real power remained tightly controlled. Key decisions stayed in British hands. Defense, finance, and foreign policy were excluded from Indian authority. Autonomy existed on paper, but not in full practice. Public gatherings were regulated. Leaders were monitored, and organizations faced pressure. The state relied on legal authority to curb movements it could no longer ignore. The 1920s became a decade of tension. Periods of negotiation alternated with moments of confrontation. Governance continued, but its confidence was shaken. Every reform raised expectations that were difficult to satisfy. Economic conditions added to the strain. Post-war hardship affected workers and farmers alike. Prices fluctuated, employment was uncertain, and dissatisfaction grew. Political demands became intertwined with everyday struggles. British administrators faced an increasingly complex task. They had to maintain order while responding to calls for change. Each concession risked appearing weak. Each act of repression risked deepening resistance. By the early 1930s, the situation demanded a larger response. Britain began drafting a comprehensive constitutional reform. The goal was to stabilize governance by reshaping it. The result was the Government of India Act of 1935. This act marked the most ambitious reform of the colonial period. It expanded provincial autonomy and extended the franchise. Elected Indian ministers took office in several regions. For the first time, governance appeared to be shifting meaningfully. Yet limitations remained clear. The central government stayed under British control. Emergency powers allowed authority to be reasserted at any time. The structure granted responsibility without full sovereignty. Indian leaders recognized both progress and restraint. Some participated in the new system, hoping to expand it from within. Others viewed it as insufficient and temporary. Debate continued over cooperation and resistance. As the decade progressed, governance grew more fragile. The machinery of rule still functioned, but its legitimacy was eroding. Laws could be enforced, but loyalty was no longer assumed. Consent had become conditional. British officials sensed the change. Reports grew cautious, language more measured. The certainty of earlier decades was gone. Governance relied increasingly on compromise rather than command. India was no longer just a colony to be managed. It was a political problem that required resolution. By 1939, the atmosphere was charged with expectation. Nationalism had become deeply rooted. Self-rule was no longer a distant goal, but an urgent demand. The colonial system, though still standing, showed clear signs of strain. The years between 1919 and 1939 transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Governance shifted from confident authority to contested control. Reforms acknowledged change, while repression revealed fear. Neither approach restored stability. Nationalism had challenged governance at every level. The empire remained in place, yet its foundations were weakened. This period did not end British rule. But it exposed its limits. When the next global crisis arrived, the structure would face a test it could not withstand. The struggle of these years prepared the ground for what followed. Governance had lost its certainty. The path toward independence was no longer avoidable. The final collapse of British control over India did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded across years of strain, sacrifice, and slow exhaustion. By 1939, the empire still appeared vast and confident on maps, yet its strength rested on fragile foundations. When global war returned, those foundations began to crack. World War II placed immense pressure on Britain and its empire. Resources were redirected toward survival. Men, materials, and money were pulled into a conflict that spanned continents. India was governed under wartime strain. Civil administration struggled to balance imperial needs with local stability. Decisions were made quickly, often without consultation. Emergency powers expanded authority, but also widened distance between rulers and the ruled. Economic pressure increased steadily. Wartime production reshaped industry, but inflation followed close behind. Prices rose. Shortages spread. Rural and urban populations alike felt the weight of disruption. Transport networks were stretched. Markets became unpredictable. Everyday life grew harder for millions. The war effort relied heavily on Indian manpower. Soldiers were recruited in large numbers and sent far from home. Their service was essential, yet the rewards remained limited. Families carried the burden of absence while coping with rising costs and uncertainty. The connection between sacrifice and recognition felt increasingly uneven. As the war dragged on, British capacity weakened. Resources were depleted. Debt mounted. Political focus shifted inward toward recovery rather than control. The idea that Britain could indefinitely govern India no longer matched the balance of power. The system endured, but without conviction. By 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but Britain emerged exhausted. Cities lay damaged. The economy struggled. Public opinion favored rebuilding at home rather than maintaining distant rule. The empire, once seen as essential, now appeared burdensome. Negotiations replaced commands. Delays replaced decisions. The sense of inevitability shifted. Britain could no longer rule effectively. Control required resources, legitimacy, and will. By the mid-1940s, all three were weakened. The cost of holding India outweighed perceived benefits. The imperial system had reached its limit. The transition toward independence accelerated. Talks intensified. Plans were drafted under pressure. Time became a critical factor. The desire to withdraw quickly shaped outcomes. Complexity was acknowledged, but urgency dominated. The priority became exit rather than perfection. In 1947, British governance ended. Authority was transferred. Administrative responsibility passed into new hands. The formal structures of empire dissolved, bringing to a close a system that had ruled for generations. Independence marked a profound shift. Power moved from imperial command to national control. The future belonged to those who would now shape it directly. The end of rule did not resolve every challenge, but it created space for self-determination. The collapse of control was not a defeat on a battlefield, but a retreat shaped by exhaustion. War had drained strength and focus. Economic strain had exposed limits. Political reality had changed. Empire, once sustained by confidence, could no longer sustain itself. For many Indians, independence represented long-awaited dignity. For others, it brought uncertainty. The transition carried hope and anxiety together. The system that had governed daily life for decades was gone, leaving both relief and responsibility in its wake. The legacy of those final years remains complex. Wartime pressures accelerated change. Economic hardship deepened awareness. Administrative strain revealed weakness. Together, they pushed the empire toward its end. Collapse did not mean disappearance. Institutions, habits, and boundaries remained. The imprint of rule could not be erased overnight. Yet the authority behind them was transformed. What had once been imposed was now inherited. The period from 1939 to 1947 stands as a passage from dominance to departure. It shows how global events can reshape local destiny. How power can fade not through sudden loss, but through gradual depletion. In the end, the system that ruled for generations collapsed under its own weight. War exposed its limits. Time eroded its control. Independence arrived not as a gift, but as the result of changing realities. The empire stepped back, and a nation stepped forward. Britain governed India through systems, not just soldiers. Laws, revenue, railways, and officials held the empire together. But governance without consent could not last forever. Understanding how Britain ruled India helps us understand the legacy it left behind. Thank you for listening and for walking through history with care. May learning from the past help us think more clearly about the future. Until next time, take care, and stay curious.